Hello, everyone, and welcome to another LetPub webinar. The webinar for today is strategies for identifying the best journal for publication. You have myself, Dr. Clark Holdsworth here, as well as Dr. Accdon-LetPub. We're going to be going over the topic with you today. If you've been with us before, you're familiar with our process. If it's your first time, welcome. So I'm going to introduce myself first and then have AV introduce herself. And then I'll cover a little bit of housekeeping in case those of you who haven't been to this or haven't been here in a while forgets how these webinars work. I'll go over the different features that we have and then let us get right into the content. So as I indicated, my name is Dr. Clark Holdsworth. I'm Senior Manager, Communications and Partnerships at LetPub. My academic background is in physiology. I have my doctorate from the College of Veterinary Medicine at Kansas State University. During that time, I worked on the dynamics of oxygen transport, primarily focused on the gradient of oxygen from ambient O2 of the air all the way down to the very low PO2s of muscle myoglobin, particularly in states of dysfunction in preclinical models such as chronic heart failure and emphysema.
All right, well, hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Accdon-LetPub. You guys can call me AV for short. I'm a research communication strategist at LetPub, so a colleague of Clark's. Prior to joining scholarly publishing, I came from a much different background than Clark. I'm a geologist at heart. I used a variety of different methods spanning anything from geochronology to geomorphology and geochemistry to study how glaciers have changed in response to climate, both in the Southern Hemisphere during my master's and then the Northern Hemisphere in Greenland for my PhD. So that's my background. I have a good amount of publishing under my belt, and I'm excited to talk to you guys today about our topic, which is selecting the best target journal for your research.
Yeah, as you can see, AV and I have different backgrounds. I think it really helps with these webinars, whereas we both have a lot of publishing experience and now experience with the current trends, what journals are looking for and that type of thing. This is what we're trying to transfer over to you in these webinars, but I think our topical background makes us aware for topics like this, where you're talking about target journal selection, how there's variation by field and that type of thing. So I believe it is helpful. I just want to go over a few housekeeping items before I hand it off to AV. She's got some great content lined up for you. First off, if you're having a little trouble with audio or video or anything, it does look like everything's okay on our end as hosts. So what I suggest you do is just go ahead and back out of Zoom and rejoin. You don't have to be permitted back in or anything like that. So that should work fine. Just a little refresh usually fixes most problems. In terms of features for how we're going to run things today, as you can see, we have the chat function here. The chat is just for you as users to go back and forth. You can shoot messages to us. I'll be in there monitoring that in case we have any issues crop up. However, if you do have something for the question and answer session, right, or Q&A, there is a dedicated function. So go ahead and go to the Q&A feature and enter your questions there. Anything that goes into chat we might miss, in particular because the Q&A has an upvote feature where you can take a look at those questions, upvote it if it's one that you were going to ask anyway. That helps us a lot. Or if you just think it's an extremely pertinent question, we're going to probably tackle them in that order based on popularity. So go ahead, leave your questions in the Q&A, upvote them there. That'll help us get through. We have, it looks like 255 people in here right now, which indicates we're going to have a lot of questions for the Q&A. You'll be helping me out because my job will be to sort of line those up for AV so we can have a good discussion afterwards. Additionally, I want to remind everybody that since we are on the PureRef platform for this, you can go ahead and go to our LetPub webinar series, Open Discussion. I'm actually going to copy and paste that into the chat right now. Make sure I send this to everyone. So that's going to be our hub. And as AV gets started here, I'm actually going to clear that and make sure that we have a fresh live board where you can also leave questions. Keep in mind that we use that hub both during and after. So if you have anything that we're not able to get to, or you want to follow up in the week or month after this webinar, we like to continue discussing these topics. In particular, if you're having questions that are specific to your scenario that you think we may be able to help with, or another attendee may be able to help with, particularly someone in your field, it's great to go there and have that discussion over the course of the next month leading into our next webinar. So just want to remind you of those features. Last thing is that this webinar is available on demand because we're doing it through the PeerRef platform. It's very easy if you want to bring it up for yourself or a colleague in the future. You can come back, view the webinar on demand. We won't have the slides. We don't release any of the slide material, but this entire recording, it's recording right now, will be available on demand. So you can share that information with colleagues. Just go ahead and forward them those emails. You should get a follow-up email about 24 hours after this webinar. It's going to include the link to that, so you don't have to worry about searching it out from us. Additionally, you're going to get a link to the webinar participation certificate. The participation certificates are provided as is. We can't make any modifications just because of the logistics of how many people we have as attendees, but you will get a link to that after the webinar if that's something that you can utilize at your institution. And now, after I've talked a little bit too much, I'm going to hand it over to AV so she can jump right into our content.
All right, well, thanks, Clark, for giving us the rundown on all of that. And again, I want to welcome everybody who's joining us today and just say thank you for coming and listening to this webinar material. For the topic today, again, it's how to select the best target journal for your research. And while this might seem like a very basic topic, it's really just fundamental to the publication process. And it's something that us as researchers, no matter the career stage we're at, is something that we're going to be dealing with throughout our careers. So for the purpose of the content today, I'm going to start with just some introduction to the topic and some basics, really answering the question, why is this topic so important to us in developing our careers and getting published in general? From there, I want to help you in learning how to identify or maybe determine the best potential journals for publication. So narrowing down that search from the thousands and thousands of journals that are out there for you to publish in. From there, we're going to take it one step further and go into choosing which one of those 3 or 5 journals you're thinking about is really the right one, the best one for you to submit to first. So the most suitable journal for your research. In the end, I'm going to give you a quick and dirty do's and don'ts of journal selection, so some final take-home points, as well as touch on some of the digital tools that can assist you in journal selection. And then, as Clark mentioned, we're going to wrap up this webinar with a Q&A. So again, if you have any questions related to the content of this webinar, or even a little bit into the general publishing process related to journals, please put those questions into the Q&A function and upvote a question if you see another attendee's question that you'd really like an answer to, because that shoots those questions right up to the top and we can make sure to answer those first. So again, why is selecting the right journal so important? Well, there are many reasons for this. First and foremost, selecting the best journal simply saves you a ton of publishing time. So all of us may be under different stresses. Some of us may be trying to graduate. Other people are trying to get a promotion, tenure, something like that, if you're an assistant professor. So cycling through many different journals or having multiple rejections is not fun. And of course, it takes a lot of time. It can waste money if there are submission fees. And of course, it's going to zap your motivation. Nobody likes to be rejected in any part of their life, but especially in publishing, especially if academia is the career that you've chosen. Another reason why selecting the most suitable journal is important is because it improves the likelihood of accomplishing some of your publishing goals. So for example, if you want to have fast publication, specifically because you have time-sensitive results, or perhaps you're in a very competitive research field, finding the best journal, the most suitable journal, that is really important because you're likely going to assist in streamlining the peer review process and therefore take less time and get your results out there. Publishing in the right journal is also important for you as you're in your own career. This is going to help match your work with other people that are in your field. So finding you the right audience, And as a result, people are going to read your work. They're probably going to more likely cite your papers, and that's going to improve your own visibility. Identifying the right target journal is also critical because submitting your work to a suitable journal is likely going to increase your chances of manuscript acceptance. If you choose a journal that doesn't even publish your type of research, or you're outside the scope, that increases your chances of rejection. So you want to find one that matches with your work the best. And then ultimately, publishing really just effectively validates your work. It helps to advance your career. If you're a faculty member, it's going to help you attract students or experienced staff to work in your labs. And of course, the more publishing that you have under your belt, indicating that you can successfully take a project home, that's going to be pretty desirable for funders who are looking to fund your future research. Now, one important point I do want to make before I move forward is that choosing an unsuitable journal is unfortunately a common mistake. So I don't want everyone listening here today to think that the fact that they got rejected from a journal is an infrequent occurrence. That is not the case. It is very, very common. And importantly, it's made by novice and experienced authors. So first-year graduate students all the way through tenured faculty can make very similar mistakes in this. So for example, a first-time author, again, this might just be your first time ever submitting a manuscript. You don't really know how to find the right journal, or perhaps you've switched fields. You're doing something different for your postdoc from your PhD, and you just don't know which field-specific journals are the best. On the other hand, experienced authors might miss new opportunities because if you've been publishing for a while, you often go back to the same journals you've always been publishing in. And while that's good, you trust those journals, you may miss out on new journals that are being developed. These journals might be open access journals that have a good reputation, but because you don't have your eyes open, you may be missing those opportunities. So all of us here together, we may be asking ourselves, so how do I get started? What are the first steps that I can do to start identifying the best journals for publication? Well, step one is really just stepping back and considering what is important to you. What factors are going to be swaying you one way or another towards choosing a different journal. I won't read off all of these bullet points here since I know you guys will have this as access on demand later. But again, certain things like indexing or impact factor may be really important to you because it's required by your institution or it's highly encouraged for a promotion. Other individuals may be thinking about publishing quickly, so acceptance and rejection rates are really important. Manuscript turnaround time. Open access may be a binary choice. Maybe, yes, I'm willing to do open access, or no, I'm not. Or do I want to publish in an international focused journal or one that's more regional, depending on the study area of my work. So again, there are a lot of different factors that go into making a journal choice, and it is up to you as the author to think about which one of those factors or a bundle of those factors is really most important. Step two is to narrow your search once you've identified those factors. There's probably going to be many, many suitable journals that fall or meet those factors that you've identified. So now it's time for you to identify maybe 3 to 5 to start that would be a good fit for your manuscript. First and foremost, the best way to identify or narrow down your search is to consult your own manuscripts reference list. You are likely reading the literature, you're citing studies that are most important to yours, perhaps the ones that you're building the novelty of your work off of, and therefore where those manuscripts are published in, the journals that you are citing, those are probably going to be a great place to start for identifying some potential publication avenues. You can take that information and discuss it with your colleagues or perhaps your advisor or other mentors. And then there's also other points to consider. Your society, if you're a part of a scientific society, you may also, they might also have a journal that could be of interest. And since you're in that society's field, the journal is probably going to connect you with the right readership. After you've identified 3 to 5 journals, maybe 10 journals, if there's quite a few in your field, I recommend that you visit the journal websites. And again, this is to make sure that your research fits into the journal's aim and scope, which I know can be a very kind of confusing thing to read. And in addition to fitting within the scope of the journal, It's also important to make sure that the journal has published manuscripts that are similar to yours. It may not be the best if they've published a manuscript that's very, very similar, simply because they don't want to have repeat publishing of similar studies, but they should relate to each other. Again, just be aware that journals do have very specific areas of focus, so it's important that your manuscript really meshes with that journal's focus. And I do have an example here that if you are in the medical field and you have a clinical research report, that's probably not going to be suitable for a journal that specializes only in basic research. So again, it does take a little bit of thinking, but you want to avoid that rejection as much as possible by doing a little bit of journal research on your own. After you've narrowed down your search, you have those 3 to 5, 10, 20 journals that you're thinking about. Now it's important to assess your options. You know what factors are important to you. You have found a few journals that are possible, but now you need to step back and ask yourself, do publishing in these potential journals meet my own publishing goals? Again, considering your research field, you may have several journals to choose from. So I'm going to jump into another list here and try to cover some of the 3 most prominent publishing goals that researchers have in general. First and foremost, one that we probably all have is to get published quickly. So ways to kind of identify if these journals are going to be suitable for you to accomplish this publishing goal is a variety of things. First and foremost, you can do a pre-submission inquiry. So instead of just blindly submitting, you can oftentimes send a cover letter and perhaps even the abstract of the paper you want to submit directly to the journal editor and ask that editor if the journal is interested in reviewing your manuscript. This kind of gives you a little insight into whether or not it's worth your time to publish. And oftentimes a journal editor will respond. Sometimes they won't, but it's not very difficult for you to reach out, and it's also encouraged. You should not be afraid to do this. Journals also advertise the average time for peer review. Again, not all journals do this, but some do. And of course, a shorter review period means less time waiting for a decision, ultimately speeding up the rate at which you can get published. Some journals that are part of bigger publishers have a thing called article transfer or cascading peer review. So say you submit to a journal, it doesn't work out, you actually get rejected from that journal. Sometimes you do have the option, typically in the editor's letter, where they say, we're willing to move your manuscript to another more suitable journal in our publishing house, and we'll send the peer reviews with that and everything. And again, that saves you time, not having to find another journal. The editor actually found one for you, and you don't have to reformat your paper and go through an entire repeated submission. So again, that's a way that can assist you in getting published quickly, and I encourage authors to consider those journals that the editor puts forward. 2 other points for getting published quickly. Again, statistics are often provided by the journal, but if they're not, you can do a little bit of sleuth work yourself. You can determine the speed of publication by looking at recent manuscripts. Oftentimes there's a little bit of information on the title page that indicates the submitted, accepted, and published dates of that research. So again, you can actually kind of find out, take the last couple recently published papers and see how long it took those papers to get published in that journal, to give you an idea of if publishing to this journal is indeed going to be fast. There's also a term called online pre-publication, and this is indicating whether or not a journal is going to publish your manuscript online soon after acceptance. So if you're concerned about getting your results out there super fast, again, there are a couple ways to do this. Preprints is another one of those. But again, if you're in a competitive field, something like that, you want to get those results out fast, you can look for online first pre-publication. So this is where the journal is going to publish an online version of your manuscript the same day it's accepted. So this is before the journal goes through all of the final typesetting, or that manuscript goes through all the final typesetting and things like that. But again, it gets your work out there for people to read as soon as possible. And this might be something that is acceptable by your institution. And that might buy you a month or so's time. So again, all of those kind of little aspects go into supporting publishing goal number 1. So again, you can do a little research in the background to identify if a certain journal is going to actually help you accomplish that goal. Publishing goal number 2 is getting published in a journal with the highest possible impact factor. Again, this is something that you need to decide if it's really important to you. Perhaps it's a little bit more restricted because it's important to your institution, your advisor, something that is required for graduation. But it is definitely a publishing goal for a lot of researchers in the community. Most importantly, you need to learn the journal impact factors. This is something that's pretty straightforward. Most journals that have impact factors indicate them on their websites, which allow you to easily compare between various journals. It is important, however, to balance your impact factor considerations with the journal's audience. It is important to understand that your research is more likely to be read and cited by other investigators in your field, only if your paper is submitted to a journal that is widely read in your field. So even when impact factor is important, or metrics in general are important, so we encourage you to select a journal that researchers in your field are actually going to read. Again, this is important for you because you want your research to get cited by others. You want to make your name in the field. So impact factor isn't the only thing you should consider. Some journals also have very similar impact factors, and kind of choosing between, a journal that all have an impact factor of 3 could be kind of confusing. So again, that's when those other factors come in, those other publishing goals as well. So you're going to want to kind of sleuth out which journal meets more of the requirements for you in publishing, and then perhaps go with that journal. The last publishing goal that you may have as a researcher is to reach the largest possible audience with your manuscript and with your science. Ensuring that you publish in a journal that is properly indexed is important. It allows your research to be found by other people in your field, ultimately read and then cited. And again, journals provide this indexing information on their websites. You may also be interested in learning the readership and circulation statistics of your journal. So these are, again, statistics on subscription rates and readership. And again, these are put on the journal websites. And in general, publishing in journals with a larger readership is simply going to mean that your work is going to be seen and cited by more researchers. So along these lines, open access is, of course, a way to reach a much larger audience than a subscription-based journal. It's going to increase the visibility of your article, and specifically because researchers that don't subscribe or their institutions don't subscribe to that journal will be able to read your manuscript. And of course, this includes the public as well. If your goal is to reach the largest possible audience, you should also consider how a journal publicizes their articles. Big, well-known journals, Science, Nature, Family, for example, those journals often get a lot of media press and attention. And as a result, those journals really promote the articles that they publish. So you want to think about, does the journal that you're thinking about promote their articles? Are they good at that? Do they have a good social media following? Do they do press releases, things like that, that is going to give your research more attention? So I've gone through a lot there, and probably we're all thinking that, oh my goodness, there is so much more to selecting a target journal than simply just looking at the impact factor by itself or the readership numbers by itself. And that's true. There's a lot going on, and that's why it is so difficult. Again, bringing it back to why it is such a common mistake among researchers, simply because there's so many factors, and I do understand that it can be quite overwhelming. So let's just take a step back and think about the steps we've gone through. First and foremost, you should determine which publishing factors are most important. What are going to be those factors that are going to lean you to choose one journal or another? Is it impact factor, readership, promotion, regional versus international? Is it publishing costs? Things like that. And again, I have what restrictions you might have, and that falls into the whole publishing cost, open access versus not. Do you have to be in a certain JCR category above a certain impact factor? So those can be your first and foremost ways of narrowing down your search. Once you understand which factors are most important to you, and you can now establish your publishing goals. So is the journal associated with those factors? Is it meeting those goals? Is it meeting your publishing objectives as well? And from there, you should have been able to narrow down your search quite well. Now, that you have these 3 journals, 2 journals, maybe that you're thinking about, what are the next questions that you need to ask to really identify the one that's most suitable? So we're going to circle back and go through a few questions that you should ask yourself. You're probably going to return to the journal's website and you need to review again the aims and scope of the journal. Do they match with your own research? This information is often readily available on a journal's homepage. It may be disguised in various forms, but often it's about the journal, full aims and scope, learn about us here, something like that. But you should be able to find that information. Oftentimes you don't even have to click to a different page. It might just be up there for front and center to give you information. Browsing this information is very critical. It helps you determine if your research is a good match for that journal. And very importantly, journals often specify the types of research that they do not publish. And I highly encourage you to pay attention to this information. For example, if you are doing a case report in the medical field, some journals do not publish case reports, whereas others do. And this is often very clear. If you're publishing a review article, some journals only publish review articles, some don't publish them at all, and some only invite solicited review articles. So you have to be asked by the journal to write a review. So you can't simply just write a review and submit. So again, be very careful about submitting to a journal. Make sure that they publish the type of research that you're presenting, because you'll be quite frustrated if you find out that you wasted time on a journal that doesn't accept the certain format that you put forward. The next question to ask yourself is, again, has that journal recently published articles similar to yours? Now, the way that you can find this out is that you're probably going to likely have referenced some of them in the citations in your own manuscript, but you can also do a search yourself. On the journal website, you can often perform a search with keywords, or perhaps even just throwing the title of your current manuscript into search the articles that have been published in that journal. And that's a really quick and targeted way for you to identify whether a journal is suitable for your own research. Another way to do this is to look at 3 to 5 similar papers, specifically ones that have been published recently. This is field dependent, so maybe 5 years, 10 years. And are these papers similar in scope, but also quality to yours? Is the amount of data in your manuscript similar to the level of data that's published in the current manuscript? Or is it much more or much less? That's going to kind of help you assess whether or not the rigor of your work is appropriate for the journal that you're seeking. And again, just in general, previous papers are excellent evidence that your research topic is of interest to the audience. And that's something that you always want to think about is the journal's audience the same audience that you want to read your work? The last question that I think can really help you narrow down which one of those potential journals is really the right or best journal is considering, again, the journal's restrictions. And again, as I've mentioned, submission to a journal that simply doesn't accept the type of article you've written is going to be an immediate rejection. So it's very easy to avoid that just by doing a little bit of research yourself, or if there's confusion, reaching out to the journal editor. Most of this information is in the information for authors or the author guidelines of your target journal. Again, in many of our webinars, we've said to pay attention to those, and here we are saying it again. But again, it's truly, truly important. So these sort of journal restrictions that you should be aware of are word count limitations. So this could be for the entire paper itself. It could vary by different article type within a journal, and it can also be section specific. Abstracts, for example, are some of the ones that have the most frequent word count limitations to be aware of. Article type, as I've mentioned previously, is also a restriction provided by a journal. Restrictions can also be publishing costs. Again, this is up to you and those factors that you consider important or are your own personal restrictions. Just be aware that there are costs associated with open access. There still can be page charges for journals, as well as costs for color figures. And formatting can also be a restriction. If a journal only wants you to format in LaTeX or something like that, and you don't have access to be able to do that, there are workarounds, there are services that can be provided to you, but that may be an immediate restriction if it's something that you can't quite adhere to appropriately. So again, understanding and being aware of a specific journal's restrictions can take that journal right out of your list of potential journals and ultimately perhaps make your search a little bit easier. My last point of information here on this slide is just to always draft your manuscript to suit the eventual target journal you select. Make sure that your work contributes to achieving the objectives or the mission of the journal. That's something that you can highlight also in your cover letter as well as your manuscript, but that's something that journal editors really look for. So it's important to not only format your paper in the right way for the journal, but also just make sure it aligns with the mission and the objectives that the journal is hoping to accomplish. So I do only have a few slides left before we go into Q&A. So if you guys do have a lot of questions, feel free to put those into the Q&A. Again, anything related to research and publishing, specifically in identifying which journals are good, perhaps experiences you've had that you'd like us to discuss, feel free to throw those in there. So right here, I have a list of just general do's and don'ts of journal selection. Some of these are topics that I've discussed today. Others are ones that I haven't quite touched on, but you should be aware of. So under the list for do's, you've heard me say it many times. You've heard Clark say it as well before. You want to check the aims and scope of the journal. Make sure your research is a good match. And along the same lines as this is check to see if the journal publishes research like yours. Again, that's going to indicate that that journal reaches the right audience for your research. Understand the journals as well as your own limitations and restrictions. One thing I didn't talk about is understanding the journal's peer review process. So what type of peer review model does the journal have? Is that something that you're comfortable with? Do you like that? Is it open peer review, single blind, double blind, post-publication? Are preprints allowed? Things like that. Those are all part of those factors to consider for you. And then lastly, you always need to consider your own publishing goals and if that journal is going to work for you. Under the list of don'ts, of course, don't fall prey to predatory journals or fraudulent publishing. This is something I didn't talk about, and it is a good topic of discussion. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask. I do recommend that as researchers, we don't focus on the impact factor alone. As I've listed, there are many, many considerations in terms of choosing your target journal. Impact factor is indeed one of them, but I don't think it should be the sole factor in your choice. Don't ignore your target audience. Again, this is the researchers that are going to read your work, cite your manuscript, so you want to be sure you publish in a journal that reaches that target audience. It's important to not trust all the claims made by a journal without doing a little bit of background research on your own. A journal may claim that they have a fast review period, but then if you again look at those submitted, accepted, and published dates, and they don't really match with what you consider fast, then you can't trust everything they say. And then lastly, as a general rule in publishing, it is very discouraged to submit to multiple journals simultaneously. So again, while we're all trying to get published quickly and save our publishing time, it is very important to only publish in submit to one journal at a time. That's just good etiquette as a researcher. So before we jump into the Q&A, I do want to touch on some of the digital tools that you can use to assist in identifying which journals are the best for publication. And I am going to do a shameless plug for our own company here. At LetPub, we do have a journal selector tool. This tool is 100% free for you as researchers. You can simply find it by going to letpub.com, clicking on our resources tab, and then going to journal selector tool. Alternatively, you can simply Google LetPub journal selector and it should come right up for you in your search engine. This tool is really fantastic. It covers thousands and thousands of journals across all different disciplines. And you can search by which factors are most important for you. Again, you could type in a keyword right into the journal name. It doesn't have to be the full journal name. This example here, I just typed in biology. You can search by subject area. You can exclude open access journals if that's what you want, or you can include them. You can write in your impact factor range and which index you're interested in. Well, you can sort by multiple characteristics or a single characteristic, and then click on the journal, get directed to the journal's website, and do your own research there. So again, this is a really excellent tool for all of you to check out. There are other tools out there as well, so you don't need to just take my word for it and look at ours. But again, there are these digital tools available to assist you with this, because the community does understand that it's confusing, it's overwhelming, and there are so many journals out there. So with that, Clark and I are very happy to answer any questions that you have. And I just want to remind everybody that this is a monthly webinar series. So we'll be back next month with some great content for everyone.
Hey, V, thanks for that. So all the basics covered. That's basically everything that you could hope to know going in from someone who's looking for their first publication or someone with substantial experience in the academic publishing world. So we covered the basics, and now I think there's some questions on just different things that people can do given the restrictions or requirements that they may have, or the problems that they experience in their field or with their institution. So I want to dive right into those. I have several of my own too, so hopefully we can get through all this. Let's start simple. The first question we have here that's the most upvoted, I think, is a great one. This is something you and I are very familiar with. So there's different types of manuscript submissions, right? Short papers, book reviews, there's also things called short communications, rapid communications, which end up being the same thing, just like different brand names with slightly different requirements, but they're trying to accomplish the same goals. For example, not all journals publish book reviews. Case reports is another big one that you and I experience a lot. We have a ton of medical researchers that are like, we need case reports, and there's been a huge shift in how case reports are published in really the last 5 to 10 years. So how do you search for an appropriate journal that publishes a certain type of manuscript? How do you go about identifying those?
Yeah, I think, again, just reading, if you're looking to publish, say, a case report, I'm sure that you've read numerous case reports in certain journals. And again, just looking at the guide for authors. Oftentimes also the journal websites highlight what type of papers have recently been published. So their homepage might be highlighting a paper in each of the categories that they publish, to not only promote that author's work, but just bring people in. So even just by scrolling the homepage of a journal website, you might see that they have a highlighted short communication, a highlighted original article, and a highlighted review. And that's a real quick way for you to identify, oh, they do publish short communications, or they do publish letters to the editor, or whatever you're interested in. So I would say the website and the guide for authors, of course, is going to have the most detailed information. And as I've also indicated, you can always reach out to the journal editor, the editor-in-chief, and get a very direct, concrete answer from them.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to add this short list to our hub as well. So I'm putting the link in chat again. But we are, so you and I are familiar with this, right? Because LetPub offers a service, journal recommendation, where we help authors. We give these 3 to 5 recommendations for journals that are competitive for their manuscript according to any parameters that they might have. And so we run into this all the time. And I think the sort of checklist is, as you mentioned, first is author guidelines. Sometimes it's also included in the scope. And this is something that I hammer because I've given talks to journal editors, to journal staff about what they can be doing for the authors. It'd be nice to have them all together in a webinar like this, but that's something that should be explicit. They should be listing it. And this is also something you can keep in mind when you're selecting a journal. If a journal is not making it easy to figure out, maybe that's not the journal for you. That's something to keep in mind as well. It's something to remind authors of. You're owed something. And so maybe that's a sign that that's not necessarily somewhere you want to go. But author guidelines, then the scope, it's sometimes listed in there. And then another option is to just review recent ones to try to find them. Sometimes it's hard, that can still be misleading. And then I think, like you said, the final thing, don't be afraid to reach out and just ask. It's really simple. And you can even give like the title of your manuscript or something to indicate it with like the abstract to see if like that fits. Do you have case reports? Does this fit a case report according to what you guys define it as, that type of thing? So yeah, that's definitely a good one.
Yeah, that's a great question.
So I'll list those. I will list like that sort of checklist on our PeerRef hub. So be sure to visit that link. Okay, another one, which is something that I wanted to cover too, how to identify a predatory journal. Because as much as this is about choosing the right journal, a big part of academic publishing right now is not choosing the wrong journal. Unfortunately, that means predatory journals. So comments on that?
Well, there are lists out there that you can view. It's important to understand, though, that these lists while they're definitely a good place to start and helpful, some of the journals and publishers that are on some of these lists may not be considered predatory anymore. One of those lists, I guess the most infamous one in publishing world, is called Beall's List. This is something that was discontinued, but is still out there a few years ago. And then another good one for researchers that I always kind of put forward is the thinkchecksubmit.com. Again, I think it's important for you, kind of very similar to impact factor, is like you get a kind of binary answer like, oh, this journal is predatory, but then I think you should really go and see if there are signs that it is, or perhaps it isn't. Perhaps it's just somebody's own opinion. So that's why it gets so confusing and murky for all of us in publishing, because some of them just have a bad reputation by word of mouth. Sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not. Do you have any concrete resources for authors, Clark, that you think?
Yeah, so the one you mentioned, Think, Check, Submit is good. Beall's List. I think the trend now is because there's kickback even against like Beall's List, because then it's like sort of gatekeeping, and it's who's choosing which are and which aren't. I think what you want to fall back on is, and the journals really put themselves in this hole, is think about COPE guidelines, right? So COPE, most journals are trying to follow COPE. They're trying to be associated with COPE because that indicates ethical responsibility in publishing. And so what I'm actually going to do here is I have the link for COPE's guidelines, principles of transparency and best practice in scholarly publishing. And as they indicate, you can use these guidelines. These are the guidelines that journals are supposed to be following. So you can also use it as a checklist for, is this a predatory journal or not? Things like, is there an author guidelines? Is there an editorial board listed with contact information? These types of things. And so just go through those, familiarize yourself with it, and then do your own vetting. And I think that's what's really being encouraged now, because predatory publishing is kind of this gray area where a journal, it's tough. You might have a journal that's just new, not fully fleshed out, not as robust, but they're not being predatory in the sense that they're trying to scam anyone, right? They're just weak in some areas, and that you may also not want to submit there until they get up to scratch, but they're not really a predatory journal. So blacklisting them can really just harm a journal that might be a great opportunity in the future. On the flip side of the coin, you might have a predatory journal that is just like superficially meeting guidelines and stuff. And so you need to really go in, familiarize yourself with these, and then make your decisions on that. COPE offers that sort of checklist to give you an idea, is this a predatory journal or not, that type of thing. So yeah, go ahead and use those.
I think that's a really, really great answer. I do also think it's important to note that while we can't deny that there have been open access journals that have been deemed predatory or have put some predatory behavior forward, it's important to understand that predatory is not synonymous with open access. There have been fraudulent predatory journals throughout the traditional publishing process. You know, in history, it used to be a librarian that would have to check to see if the periodicals they were putting on the shelf were actually, you know, putting forward the ethical guidelines, Clark, like you said. And if that journal looked good on the outside, had a great cover, first great pages, and then not very strong articles, nothing was typeset, nothing was like actually quality controlled, but the librarian didn't see it in person, and then they started subscribing to that journal, that was a fraudulent publisher. And again, it was not open access, it was a historical journal, you know? So just while in the community or in researchers' minds, open access has been thought to be predatory kind of as a blanket comment. Again, I think just doing your own research, looking at those COPE guidelines, and doing a little bit of sleuthing on your own, talking to colleagues, their opinions and things like that also matters. I would take that into consideration.
Yeah. So it's, this is a big misconception, so I'm glad you brought it up. Open access does not equal predatory. Initially, during the initial open access boom, there was people taking advantage of the fact that now you're charging APCs for the process, right? And that was listed as a thing against open access. Oh, it's going to be a slippery slope. Well, we've shown it's not a slippery slope. Open access went through that rough early period, which you might expect, people taking advantage. people learned, they found their way around these predatory journals, COPE instituted these guidelines, and so now open access is very common for the majority of journals. Every single publisher tends to have a sister journal that's open access, or they do hybrid open access. So it's been successful, and to associate OA with predatory would be a huge, huge mistake. It should be an extra red flag for you, something to double check, because now you are going to be paying out money for the publication process up front rather than paying to read it. You're paying so that everybody else can read it for free. So just be aware that that's how a predatory journal is going to take advantage of you and get their money, but OA does not equal predatory at all. And I also want to mention there, this is another thing, because I was asking people, we know people might have restrictions, all the way from sort of outdated restrictions at their institution of requiring minimum impact factors. That's getting less and less common, but just over to like soft sort of lists and things, like people have categorization systems. You can only publish in these journals, that sort of stuff. So one thing you can also do is use the COPE guidelines to legitimize a journal that you want to publish in. So you simply, again, I find like if your institution has lists and stuff, people tend to not actually care about it on an individual basis. So if you go to them and say like, I want this journal added to the list, and here's why it's legitimate, and you show them that it aligns with all the COPE guidelines and everything, administrators are just going to be okay. They're just going to go, because they don't really know why they're doing it to begin with, that have these restrictions, and they're outdated for a reason. So don't be afraid to use the COPE guidelines to defend your choice of manuscript as well. Once you've vetted that you've chosen a good journal, you've used those guidelines. If you need to defend it to someone else for tenure promotion, that type of thing, go ahead and use those COPE guidelines as a resource there. Okay, and then let's move on to, how do you know the audience of a certain journal? So we talked about like readership and that type of thing. Well, what are your cues, AV, for readership?
Basically, I guess just the focus of the journal. And I also think, as we always go back, the aims and scope is another thing. They always indicate this is the audience, like, but like different, they usually list type of people, biologists are the primary readers, or clinicians of this X, Y, and Z are our primary readership. Sometimes it's very clear and easy. Again, though, I think if you just have a very specialized journal, what that journal publishes is going to be the researchers that read it. Most of the time, I think it's going to be academics, unless perhaps maybe you're more in engineering, then it could be, industry professionals. That would be the audience that's thinking about your work as well. What about you, Clark?
Yeah, I think with the point you just made, that's why society publishing is something I really want to encourage people to look at. When a journal is published by a society, you instantly know readership, right? And in particular, if your paper, if the readership you're interested in reaching is, like you said, industry or that type of thing, then you can be looking at these professional societies where they're very concerned about not just academics, but professionals in the field, that type of thing. So that's huge. I've promoted, if anybody's been to previous talks by us, I promote the society journals. I think they're a great mechanism for getting published, particularly for people who are struggling in this wider world of academic publishing. So use that, like you said, though, scope, author guidelines, simply looking at what's published, because what the people publishing are the people reading, right? That type of thing. But yeah, then you can, again, if there's some backing to it, if there's a society, a group that's already tied to it, then you can just look at that group and know, exactly who you could expect to be reading this journal that you're going for. Let me find, because I have some of the list is changing now. Oh, this is a very common one. Where can I get the listed journals? AV, you pointed to LetPub, which we have a great journal selector tool that's extremely widely used. And I think that's why a lot of you are here and we get such good attendance at these webinars, as you found us through that journal selector tool. So obviously go to that. I think it's been posted in chat. I'll post it again. Also, I want to say, just go to PeerRef, the platform that we are on right now. If you go to this link, This is going to be another database, similar information. Within the peer ref database, there's already some robust commenting because that's a big key. You can sort of maybe see if other people are leaving their experiences or their subjective opinions about the direction they think the journal is going. So be sure to visit that. I did want to mention that LetPub is looking to add some new features to the journal selector tool. So if you're a regular user, keep going to it because we are going to make some updates, perhaps on things like flagging for any issues you're finding with journals, stuff like that, a rating system, that type of thing. So be sure to revisit that because we're going to have some more robust systems in place that'll allow you to look at sort of the crowdsourced data from your colleagues in a more quantitative way so you can make a decision based on that. So I think those are two good ones for a list of journals.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, Clark, as you said, kind of the crowdsource information, the data that you get from your colleagues and your mentors, that's a really excellent place to start. You shouldn't be nervous about asking your mentor, your advisor, what journals they recommend, because they do have more experience in, identifying whether your work is high impact in the field or moderate impact or something. So they can kind of, I think, guide you for sure. And at least those first steps, narrowing down your search, and then it might be ultimately up to you from there.
Sure. So we got some other good ones here. I just want to remind everybody that this will be available on demand. So if you want to share with a colleague or anything, or you just want this material again afterwards, just give 24 hours. You're going to get a follow-up email, and this entire presentation will be available to you on demand. Impact factor. So we mentioned, this is just a brief question. Impact factor is not the only thing to be considered. We just want to reiterate. If you feel pressured to consider impact factor as the only thing, you really need to evaluate why you're publishing, and you need to maybe, if you're in a bad situation with your institution or something, you need to consider other ways to encourage them so that you can publish in the journals that you want. Keep in mind that impact factor is used as a surrogate for citation quality, right? Ultimately, impact factor is the most important thing, sort of, because it's supposed to reflect how much you're going to get cited, and that's what you're going for. You're producing work so that it can get cited. That's the evidence that it's good work. However, impact factor is, again, a journal level metric, not an article level metric. So if you're just chasing impact factor, rather than going to journals where you think people are actually going to look at your article and use that citation in future articles, you might not, you might be chasing the wrong thing. So keep in mind that your H index, even H index isn't perfect, but at least that's where you're actually tracking your own citations. And so don't compromise your H index to chase impact factor. If you think you can get cited somewhere, go to the journal where you think you can get cited, and then point to your H index when you're dealing with your university, when you're dealing with your tenure and promotion committee. But yeah, I just wanted to reiterate that it's not the only thing for that question. This is sort of another question, but let's go ahead and answer it really briefly. It'd be, if you get your article rejected outright or anything, is it okay to follow up with questions? Maybe you can tie this into, finding a journal. If you submit somewhere and you're rejected, should you follow up and maybe see why you got rejected? You can maybe phrase it as you're looking for your next journal then, and how can we determine, like, did this really not fit the scope? Can you explain why it didn't fit the scope? Maybe to pressure the journal a little bit and also give yourself some more information moving forward. Yeah,
I think that if you get rejected outright with no justification, then yes, of course, you can request a reason, because that's pretty unfair. That's not like in my opinion, a good quality in a journal. I think one of the bullet points I had under factors to consider was quality of the peer reviews, as well as quality of the editorial board and the editors that you work with. So you should be receiving fair treatment and everything like that. And so there should be no problem with you reaching out to get more information, especially if it was not justified.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you mentioned, you can always phrase it like that, because sometimes they give justification, but it's really as good as no justification. Like, oh, it doesn't fit the scope, right? Oh, why doesn't it fit the scope? Don't be afraid to follow up. that can pressure them a little bit. Maybe they'll reconsider it. And if not, they give you more information for your selection, and that's how I'd word it. So you said it didn't fit the scope, but I'd like to know why, because of, X, Y, Z. This is the scope. I feel like this part fits that scope. Could you explain why, so that I can make a better decision for my next journal, that type of thing? Then they might feel obligated to do a better job with that redaction. So yeah, if you think it's a good paper.
I was just going to say, make sure to back up your appeal or email with evidence. So if they say it was rejected because it was not in our scope, and you say, I don't know what that means, but then in their scope, it directly says, we don't accept this type of paper, and that's the one you submitted, you just need to make sure that you don't get yourself caught in hot water. So just do a little bit of research, but yeah, feel free to email and reach out.
So another one here, this is kind of about what's the balance, AV, between the question is, what do you think about the likelihood of a journal publishing a topic that it is published on before, perhaps several times? Is it more likely for them to publish another one? And I would say it's balance, right? So do you have any suggestion on where that balance is? Obviously, they want to publish on a topic because it's within the scope. They're going to publish on it consistently, right? But how much is too much? Does it change if it's like reviews versus original research articles, that type of thing?
Yeah, I think that's very journal dependent. For example, like a very high impact journal, Nature or Science, they're not going to publish a very similar article very frequently, because that's just, they need to cover a lot of different fields. They're interdisciplinary journals. And by comparison, if you're looking at a very, very specialized field that routinely publish on any sort of changes in that field, even if they're considered incremental or something like that, they're very much more likely to publish something that, again, still moves the science forward. So there always has to be some sort of impact and novelty, even if it is a very specialized field, but it's probably more likely to publish more similar journals or more similar articles more frequently, as compared to a large scale interdisciplinary journal that's very broad.
Yeah. One thing that you can do, I suggest, is take a look at a journal and then take a look at the, try to find authors that have published a string of studies. This may be field specific, happens a lot in my field. My laboratory does this a lot, where you have studies that end up building on each other. There's significant differences in each one, such that they're separate publishable units. But you can very clearly see that one study is building on another one and leading to another one in this sort of preclinical work that we did. And if you can find that in the journal, that gives you a good idea of how receptive the journal is to that type of thing and how derivative it really can be. So sometimes if you try to get too derivative with that, where the next study is just such a small difference from the previous study, or it's very clearly like you're recycling and tweaking one thing, trying it in a different manner, they may not be as interested as publishing that as a topic that's been published before. However, of course, they're going to publish on the same topic. So you can use that to figure out how much it has to expand upon the previous publication within that sort of topic. And then on the review side, what I would suggest is reviews will need to demonstrate that a new review is warranted. And that's not simply the passage of time. And so you just need to look at, does my review that I propose to submit deviate significantly from one on the previous topic in terms of expansion of information? Has enough new stuff happened that the journal can warrant publishing on it again? But I think the journal is always going to publish on the same topics. That's the whole point of the journal. They have a scope and certain things they want to publish on, but you can use these subtleties to determine if yours is likely to be published again, like you said, within a certain time frame, that type of thing.
Yeah, I think a little bit of this is also on the author's part. I mean, if you're developing your PhD and say it's going to have, you want 3 manuscripts, if you can parse out your manuscripts and it makes sense that there are 3 papers, then I think a journal is probably going to agree with you and desire to publish them as 3 separate papers. But if it's really difficult for you and you're like, oh, I don't even know if this warrants a separate paper than this one, then that maybe suggests you don't have enough data for another paper. So if you did write that separate paper that was a little bit weak, it's probably more unlikely that a journal is going to want to repeat publish something like that. They would have preferred you throw that data into the first manuscript, for example. So I think you can kind of use a little bit of your own judgment too. If you think it's worthy of a manuscript, if you get support from your colleagues and mentors, it's probably going to be able to find a home in the appropriate journal with like the right readership.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's a technical question, and I'm not sure I'm going to understand this fully, but I think I get where the user is coming from. So in selecting a journal, there's several factors such as Q1, Q2, et cetera. I think what they mean there is the quartiles. And
yeah, I'm not as familiar with this myself. But yeah.
So quartile, I think what we're referring to here is like the SCImago quartiles.
Yeah,
so you have your site score. There's other quartiles for sure, but because those are the ones I think presented like on our tool, for example, I think that's what we're referring to here. There's also categories at certain countries. China has a category system for the Chinese Academy of Sciences. I don't think that's what we're referring to here, so correct me if I'm wrong, but these quartiles, you may have a Q1, Q2, but between quartiles, you may have like a higher impact factor journal in quartile 2 than another journal in quartile 1. How does this happen? Do you want me to take this one? I think
yeah, sure. If you have an answer,
okay.
Go for it.
Well, what you're doing, the problem here is that the site score is not the same thing as the impact factor. And this is a problem when you have all these various sort of indices that we're using. And so it's not calculated the same. And so you could vary, they're not done by the same company. They're not even accessing the same database. So those quartiles are based on a database that has way more journals. The SCImago has way more journals in their database than the JCR, which is responsible for the IF score. So obviously your quartiles in a much larger database are going to be totally different. And so they're not calculated the same. So you're comparing sort of apples to oranges. You can easily have a higher impact factor journal in a Q2 versus a Q1 because the Q2, Q1 system is not based on the same database and it's not calculated the same. It's not quartile 1 and 2 for impact factor. It's quartile 1 and 2 for site score. So I think that's where you're seeing that problem. Again, if these assumptions I'm making about what you're referring to are correct. But yeah, that's why. So this is where I think sometimes it's too bogged down. We have too much going on and we end up confusing authors a little bit. But yeah, that's why you may have see these differences in IF. Also, even if they're the other thing is they're not published on the same frequency. And so you may have like an IF that changes for the year, but the quartiles haven't undergone their next publishing for that year with the updated numbers. So yeah, there's 3 different factors that would make these completely staggered across each other. And so I wouldn't compare them. Yeah, no, that would be my answer, but you probably said it way more eloquently than I could. So I definitely support what you said. And that's what I think too, again, if the assumptions were correct. Yeah, please, if you guys, if that's a similar question that you had and I was making the wrong assumption there though, please check out the PeerRef Hub and ask me that question there. I'd be happy to answer it today, like right after this, if I was unclear about what you're referring to, we can get you a better response. Yeah, also if any attendee has their own insight into that or any information to share, well, we're always happy to answer questions on the Hub. Please ask questions, but also if you can answer another attendee's question, go for it. We welcome your insight as well. What do you think, Clark? Maybe one question? Yeah. There's one here that I'm a little bit concerned about. It's some journals claim a high IF based on ISI. How can that be evaluated? I think this question is related to, there's a lot of predatory indexers out there, just like we talked about predatory journals. There's a lot of like fake sites like making up impact factors or like doing their own impact factor ranking because they're basically trying to take advantage of the fact that the entire academic community and all you authors are so concerned with impact factor, and they're trying to pretend to be something that they're not. They're not. The IF is calculated according to Clarivate, and they're the only ones that have control of it. Anybody else trying to report an impact factor is illegitimate, and they actually Clarivate tries to shut them down as much as possible because they have that copyright on the impact factor. But yeah, if you're only use impact factor that comes from the journal citation report, which is published by Clarivate Analytics, and I will actually bring it up really quick. and I'm going to post it into chat for you guys. I really don't want anybody being taken advantage of by this. That link, that's where you're going to find your impact factors. Anybody else trying to report an impact factor, any site trying to get you to come there to use their impact factors, don't use it. Okay. There's already concerns about impact factor in general, but at least make sure you're using the right impact factor, the real impact factor. I don't know, again, I don't know if that answered the question. Please follow up with me in the hub if you can afterwards. But yeah, based on what it sounds like, just ignore anything that's not coming from them with regards to impact factor. And anything else here? I think we have just maybe like, actually, I think we covered all of it pretty much. If you have any other follow-up questions, please check out the hub for us. But we'll wrap this one up here, I think. A couple reminders from me for housekeeping, and then I'll let you say your goodbyes, AV. You are going to get the follow-up email within 24 hours. So just hold off on emailing us or anything until then. Just give it a little bit of time. Within 24 hours, you get a follow-up email. It includes two things. It's going to have your link to the on-demand webinar. Feel free to share that with anyone you want, colleagues, if you think they benefit from this talk. Also, you're going to see the webinar certificate of participation link. You click on that, it just takes you to a PDF. Unfortunately, that's only available as is. If for some reason you need confirmation, or your institution need confirmation, just give them our email. We'd be happy to confirm that it's a valid webinar certificate for you as a participant. And then, as you mentioned earlier, AV, we're going to have the next webinar in May, so be on the lookout for that. But any closing thoughts on our topic for today?
No, again, just if anyone has further questions or want to share their own submission experiences or even insight on journals, again, PeerRef is an amazing platform for that. You can discuss with us directly throughout the rest of the month on this topic. So please input your questions into the discussion forum. And also, if you want to contribute to the community, browse the journals on PeerRef and leave some comments about your most recent submission experiences to help authors and help them identify which journals are the best for their papers.
Yeah, that would be excellent. That would be very, very good. Thanks so much for all the content that you covered today, B. That was a ton, and we'll see everybody at our next webinar for sure. So,
sounds good.
take care. Enjoy, everyone.
Bye.